Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest Coach in Focus webinar here at the Playing Field. My name is Stephen Dillon. I'm also joined by Jose Figuera and also joined today, very luckily, by Paul Temple, who many of you will know from previous Coach in Focus episodes over the years. And many of you that are tuning in from New Zealand will know Paul from his time at various New Zealand clubs. Has also worked in age group national teams as well as the Wellington Phoenix as both the academy director and the women's A-League head coach, and has recently made the move back to England to be the assistant coach of Bristol City W.F.C in the Women's Super League 2. So very, very happy to have Paul back on the Coaching Focus, and very much looking forward today to listen to some of his experiences over the years and more specifically, most recently at Bristol City Women. So first of all, Paul, thank you very much for coming back on, and welcome back to Coaching Focus.
Thank you, guys. Pleasure to be here as always. Nice to see you. I'm going to talk today a little bit about identifying players and recruitment in professional clubs. It's definitely been a topic that's been extremely interesting to see how it's been done differently this side of the world compared to New Zealand and the A-League. So yeah, I'll take you through a little bit of a presentation first, and then I can get my face on the screen and we can go through some questions after.
Excellent. So how these webinars work for those that are tuning in is there'll be around 30-40 minutes of presentation, and at the end there'll be some facilitated question and answer which Jose and I will go through. And with all of our guests that we've had on the Coaching Focus recently, if there are any questions that people do have post webinar, then please feel free to get in touch, and Paul will do his best to answer those in good time. So we'll hand over to Paul for the start of the presentation. And thank you again for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, Paul.
Great, thank you. Right, so player ID and recruitment in professional clubs is an extremely complex topic, and I would probably say from experiences so far that no two clubs do it the same way. There isn't a golden formula, and some clubs are a lot better at it than others. So I'll take you through some processes that I've been experiencing this season with Bristol City, and show you a little bit of an insight into how we're identifying players and recruiting them into the first team. So the first part of this comes from identification. So we have like a preparation phase really, where we have to understand what we're looking for and how we're going to go through the process of recruiting a player. So the first step is really to do a gap analysis. So this is around understanding your squad, the team that you're going to put out every week, and what type of players you want in what positions within your team. So this process started before I arrived at Bristol City, with new signings coming in for the season, and then also as pre-season kind of went on, we were analysing what type of players we have in the team and potentially what areas we may need to strengthen in, and what type of players would strengthen us in that team. So we're kind of doing that gap analysis as we're going and as we're playing. Once we've figured that out, we need to understand why there is a gap, that in terms of why do we need a specific player with specific skills to perform in the team at that time. And that helps us really work out what we need. And that process that we have takes place amongst coaches and recruitment staff, and there's lots of kind of informal discussions at this point. So I'm going to use fullbacks as an example. So many of you will know there's lots of different types of fullbacks, and you can have really attacking fullbacks, really defensive fullbacks. You can have fullbacks of different strengths. So when you're analysing, we might need a new fullback in the team because we're short in that area, or one of our fullbacks may be injured and we need to replace them. There could be a variety of reasons. You're really trying to understand what type of fullback you need within your system of play, so to speak. So then you get into how you're going to assess this situation, because it's not as easy as just going and finding what fullbacks are available, because they really need to fit into your team dynamic. They need to fit into your culture. They need to fit into your physical profiling. They need to fit into your technical and tactical profiling. So you've really got to, at this point, establish how you assess the criteria. What's the criteria that you need in terms of any new players that you're bringing in, sorry. So there is so much data at the moment in terms of statistics that are out there on the internet, but so many people are watching football, analyzing football. There's so many different ways that you can look at statistics and data. So it's important to understand which parts of that data are important to you and what ones you're going to assess players on. So really, I guess, narrowing down that criteria. Then you get into some details of when you kind of have a bit of an idea of what it is that you're looking for, you then need to do a bit of a search and go through which players meet this criteria. Then after that, you deep dive into the data. So once they've kind of, I guess, ticked a few boxes in terms of they meet the basic criteria that you're looking for, then you start deep diving into the data and you work out, is this player somebody that can fit into our team, and is the data good in terms of what they're looking for? Then you're comparing. All right. So I think what's really important here is understanding as well that when you're doing a comparative analysis, you're trying to figure out, are they going to improve on what we currently have? So if they're, for example, if their data is not as good as the players that you currently have in that position within your squad, then obviously that's kind of telling you that this player is not going to particularly improve you in the areas that you want. So you've got to really understand, what are you comparing it to? Then you've got to filter the data to understand, if I'm looking at a player that's currently playing in the NWSL in America, which is one of probably the top two leagues in the world, and then I'm also comparing a fullback that might be playing in the A League, the standards are quite different. So the A League player might have really good data in the A League, but when you compare that to data from, say, the NWSL or from the WSL here in England, from La Liga in Spain, you have to weight the data. So you have to understand that it's not going to be completely equal. So that weighting process is all part of comparing your analysis. Once you've gone through that stage, then the old-fashioned eye test is still very much important. So you have to watch games on your whatever kind of programs I guess you're using. Like, for example, Y Scout might be a good tool that maybe some people are aware of. So you can start watching games, you can start watching them play, you can start looking at their specific clips, and you're doing a little bit of an eye test on, okay, this player looks and feels like somebody that we might want to sign. And then ideally, you can go and watch them play live, which I found in recruitment in the A League was a massive problem if they weren't already in the A League, because obviously geographically, if you're going to go and watch a player that's currently playing in America, that's a very expensive and long drawn out process of doing an eye test in person and going to watch their games. In Europe, it is a lot easier, and so therefore it's most likely that we would be able to go and get some eyes on a player from somebody within our department, from within our club, and we can scout and watch the player live playing for their team or playing for their international team. And then the last part of it is to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into what are their characteristics. So you can see a little bit of this on the pitch in terms of, do they show resilience if things aren't going well? How do they react to certain situations? What's their kind of energy like when they play? How do they interact with their teammates? How do they interact with their coach? You can get a lot of this information from watching a player, but then you also want to, where you can, make some phone calls, speak to people that might have worked with this player before, that they may have played with this player before, and just kind of really do a little bit of analysis on what they're like as a person, what they're like as a professional, and give you a bit of an idea of what their characteristics are. So that's kind of all of the processes into small bite-sized chunks. And the ones that I've highlighted in purple there, I'll go into a little bit more detail on those particular ones and show you some examples so it makes it a little bit clearer. So in terms of preparation, this would be an example of playing model. So we need to really understand what we're about, how we want to play in possession, out of possession, what our transitions are like, and we really need to understand what we're trying to do in each moment of these games, because this will help us to understand what type of player is going to fit within our system. So if you're a team that has a really, I guess, a real big influence, or sorry, a real big emphasis on counter attacking, and you're going to sort of defend in a bit of a lower block and you're going to try and counter attack, then you need somebody that's going to fit within that style of play. If you're somebody that's going to try and possess the ball and build up from the back and try and break down somebody's high pressure in the build phase, then you're going to need somebody that's going to be able to fit that from a tactical point of view. So you really have to understand this is how we're going to play. These are the types of players that we want within our system, and this is how we're going to make things work. So you have to be clear on how you want the players to play. How you play and what is expected leads to what's important. So you, from your playing model, you're then looking at what are we expecting this ideal player that we're going to try and recruit to do within our team, and really highlight the important things, which I'll come on to using fullbacks in a second. Then you can create some positional profiles that ensures that you get that right fit into your game model. So this is a process that we started this year with Bristol, because there's a completely new coaching staff and lots of new performance staff. So we had to, I guess, start from the beginning in terms of a game model, and then creating some profiles that fit within that game model. Once you do that process and you go through it, we found that it really aligned everybody, so that there was great clarity between the coaches, the analysis departments, the data departments, and the recruitment team, because then we were all very aligned on, right, we know what we're trying to do on the pitch, we know the type of players that can fit into this, and then therefore when we go out and we're looking at recruitment, we understand exactly what it is that we're looking for. So this is an example of a profile that we did for a fullback. So we started off by asking ourselves the question, who are the best fullbacks in the world? What would be the gold standard for fullbacks? So for each position, we picked out who we felt in the women's game were the strongest players in the world that would fit our system. So what would be our absolutely perfect buys, so to speak, if there was no limits to who we could bring in and things like that. So we picked out these players to give us a bit of a gold standard, and then we worked through what are the key things that we want in possession, out of possession, and what do we need from them across the four corners. So there's obviously lots of things you can have for a fullback. So we listed all these, we did a bit of a brainstorming exercise, and then it was really important to try and narrow these down to just 2 or 3 in each section, so that it could be very clear and not too confusing, and we could use the data clearly and we wouldn't have too many data sets to be working with. So these were the things that we looked at in terms of fullbacks for our in possession, out of possession, and then as you can see here, the four corners, we had like a technical side of things, a tactical, a physical, and a psychological. All right, so that they were the things that were most important to us within our game model for fullbacks. Then what we did was we came up with in possession and out of possession to match the criteria that we have on the left. We came up with these. This was the data criteria that we were going to search through and look at in terms of these were the important parts of the data to us that we were going to assess. So in possession, we were going to look at build up and their passes in build up phase, their passing XP into the final third, so how they can progress the ball forwards, crossing and their crossing accuracy, their expected assists, and their dribble and carry success. That was what we were looking for in possession. And then out of possession, how many times they are disrupting penalty box penetration, so stopping the ball from coming into the box. That's blocking crosses and blocking passes into the penalty area. Then it was disruptions in the penalty box. So once they're in there, how much are they able to influence and disrupt the actions that are going on from the attackers? And then what their dual win percentage and aerial win percentage were. And so that data we were able to kind of look at ourselves and give to our partner companies that we're working with in data. And then we could screen all the fullbacks that were interesting to us, and we could look at all of those statistics in terms of the data from them in those two areas, and that would kind of help us to really whittle down which players that we went out and we targeted. So in terms of details then, when you get that part in itself is pretty complex, but when you get to the next part, signing players is a really complex business, and there's a lot of details that go on. So one of the things that came that I hadn't experienced that came to me when I arrived in England was to get players into the UK. You need to have what they called GBE points. So this is enough points for a person to be able to come in and get a professional contract and play in the UK. Slightly different GBE criteria for, say, the men's Premier League because of the global nature and brand that it is. There is like quite strict criteria underneath the Premier League and in the women's game around what type of players you can bring in. So this is a slide that our analysis department created for the coaches to help us understand how GBE potentially works. And so what was interesting here is understanding how the weighting of different competitions and how well their teams did in those competitions and how many minutes that they played within those teams affected their GBE score. And so you're trying to get 25. That is what you're looking for in terms of somebody that you know will be approved and given a visa to come and play in the UK. If they're slightly under that, you can make a case and put forward around why you would want this player to come in, and you may be able to get them in on slightly less than that. But you know that once they hit 25, it's pretty much like a guarantee. If they're on 24, you've got a very good chance of getting them in. If it's 23 and under, then it becomes a little bit more difficult. So we were looking for that, and we were basically using a traffic light system of green, yellow, and red in terms of players met points. And so this essentially explains in Norway, in Sweden, in Holland, and in Germany what the different weightings were. So these were the teams that finished in the top three from the previous season, and you can kind of see here. I'll use the top one, Vålerenga, as an example. So if a player plays for Vålerenga, because they finish first in their competition, they automatically will get 17 points for being in a team that plays in that league and finishes top in that league. Then they'll get some more points for the Champions League games and where they finished in the cup. So that will kind of get them to 22 points, if you like. They can also then get more points if they play more minutes. So for Vålerenga, if you finish top, you have to play at least 30% of the minutes, which isn't a huge amount, as you can imagine. But if you finish second, you needed to play 60% of the minutes. It's very complicated. Then you kind of get into Champions League and cup minutes, and then on top of this, you can also add in points that you get for playing international football. So if a person that you're looking at is an international and they play for their national team, depending on how many minutes they play and what their percentage of minutes is for the national team, can also mean that they can get some more points for that. So if somebody's a little bit short in their club criteria, they can top up if they play enough international football as well. So if we were looking at a player from Bayern Munich or from Wolfsburg or from Twente in Holland, then we know that pretty much anyone that's playing for those teams would get enough points to get in. If we're looking for players that are playing for the teams that are underneath those or in different competitions, it really is a very, very complex process of working out exactly how many points they get on the GBE scale to know whether or not we would be able to sign them. So this is a really interesting part of the details process, because from experience, quite a few players that you identify come up short straight away in terms of GBE points. And so you have to understand that even if it's somebody that fits and their data is great and they look really good, if they don't get enough points, you're not going to be able to sign them. So it's a very kind of complex process. Luckily, the coaching staff don't have to do all this. We have a analysis department and a recruitment team that do this for us, but it is quite complex. Moving on, I guess, to the next part. This is just a screenshot really of we're using this information from Huddle Stats Bomb, which is one of the things that we look at. And this is really just giving us our comparative analysis. And so this is a player that already plays for us and is a fullback within our squad. And Mary started pretty much most of the games this season, so she's a regular fullback in the squad at this point in time. So the reason that we kind of look into this is to give us an understanding of the key criteria that we're looking at. So you can sort of see on this diagram in the middle here, it gives us an idea of where, I guess, she's strong and where there's some areas for improvement. And you can manipulate this data sets to suit what I was talking about before in terms of the exact ones that you're looking at. And you can see on the right hand side in the bottom right hand corner, this gives us an overall value for those particular things, and it gives us a percentile that we can compare her to for the rest of the league. And so this also enables us to kind of see where our players are stacking up in terms of comparative across the league, but also where other players that are playing for different clubs in the league stack up in comparison to our players. So this is quite a good tool for us to have. So you can see here, for example, that there's some really high ratings, particularly the tackling and dribbling pass percentage. So we talked before about on one of the criteria for us looking at fullbacks was that carry percentage. And so dribbles and carry percentages and how successful they are at that. And you can see here that Mary is in the 99th percentile in the league. So she's top, if not, she'll be one of the top in terms of that particular statistic. And she has really high value in that particular skill set. All right. And the same in terms of XG assisted. She's really high in that percentile and has really high value there. So using this as a bit of a comparative when we're bringing players in, we'd say, okay, Mary would be a regular starter for the team, and she's really strong in these areas. This is how potential other recruits would compare against her. If we wanted, say, the same type of fullback on the other side of the pitch, or potentially if Mary was going to be out for a long period of time and we were going to miss her from the team, we'd have something to be able to compare that against. So we use a lot of this information when we're doing that process. Then once we've kind of worked through the detail, then the recruitment process goes into a kind of different phase, if you like. So once we've found our player and we've got somebody that we feel like, right, this is a player that we are confident is going to fit our team, going to fit our style, meets the criteria, meets the GBE, all of the data stacks up, and we've done the eye test. Then we go into the next part, which is the analyst will create clips of this player. And obviously, as I said previously in the presentation, we've all been aligned on exactly what it is that we're looking for within the criteria of that particular position. So again, if we use fullbacks, the analyst will know, right, these are the things we're looking at for fullbacks, and this is the data that we're going to use when assessing the fullbacks. So then they'll get clips in those areas. Now, whether they are clips that are really strong in terms of like this is a strength of theirs, or whether this is something still needs to be worked on, because you might have somebody that's 20 years old and has real high potential in those areas, but still needs a bit of work. So they create a group of clips which will essentially say these are the strengths that are going to fit into our system, and these are the things that we feel we need to help you with in terms of improving to continue to be optimal in our system. So the analyst will do those clips. Then the coach creates a presentation for a player, and this will essentially be a whole raft of different things. In terms of the football, this is going to be around, they'll talk them through the clips. So this will be about kind of analyzing and showcasing in the presentation. These are the areas of strength that we really like about your game, and this is why we think you're going to fit into our system. Then it will be showing them how we play and giving them some insight into this is how we play, and this is what we'd like you to do to fit into our system, and this is how we see that happening. And then there's other things in there around career progression, where we see if you came and played for Bristol City, this is how we would see you moving up, and this is what we could do for you in terms of your career. There's also a lot of information about the area, coming to Bristol, living in Bristol, what there is to do here. We're lucky we have a really nice city, and we have a major airport that gets you to pretty much anywhere around the world. So all those things are kind of put into the presentation, particularly for overseas players. Then it would be a meet with the player and their representatives, and this could be in person or this could be online, depending on where they're based. If it's easy enough to do, the preference is always to do it in person, but that's not always possible. So sometimes this could be in an online meeting. Once they've had that meeting and the coach has done the presentation to the player, then after that, the recruitment department and the agents, they connect. So there's a little bit of time, a few days, maybe up to a week, for a player to kind of digest all the information and have a think. And then they'll reconnect, the recruitment department and the agents will reconnect. If everything is in a good position going forward, then the next stage is that a contract is offered, and then there'll be negotiations around that contract. If things keep progressing and everything's positive, then the next stage is that the player agrees the deal. Once the player agrees the deal and is happy with the contract, then there'll be a medical date that's set, and the player will come in to do the medical. This happens 99% of the time. In a really extreme case, you may arrange a medical outside of the club, that they do in a different country, a different place with an approved medical provider. But so far, the experience that I've had, everybody comes into the club at that point and does the medical, because it's also a really good way for them to meet the medical team and get a bit of an understanding of coming into the training ground and all those things. So the player usually wants to do the medical on site, and so do the medical team. So it's most of the time it's on site. Then there'll be the medical and the testing, and then providing that the player passes all of those tests and passes the medical, then the final part is the player signs the contract, and you have a new player. And so that's the whole process, broadly speaking, in terms of right from the very start, in terms of the identification and then all the details and processes that you have to go through before you even get to this slide in terms of speaking to the player and agreeing the deal. And then the last bit would just be about what happens between windows. So there's transfer windows, as I'm sure people are aware. And so between these two transfer windows, which might be between January and the summer or between summer and January, there's two windows here in the UK, then we'll continue to do that gap analysis and work out, are there areas that we need to improve on? Are there gaps that we need to try and fill within the squad as we're building it? But then also there's a continuum here around, it's not necessarily always about players that you go and identify and look at their statistics and data. Sometimes opportunities are presented to you. An agent might bring a player of theirs to your attention and present them, I guess, to the recruitment team and say, this is one of my players. They're going to be available in the next window. We're looking at options. In the professional game here in Europe, you can start talking to clubs in the last 6 months of your contract. So this is where some of those opportunities come up. And so the agent won't necessarily know exactly what we're looking for, but they might present a player and then that might fit into terms of what we're looking for. And so we haven't necessarily gone out and found that player through our analysis and our data scouting, but we've been presented with a player that maybe plays in a position that we need, and then we'd put them through that process of, do they meet the criteria that we want? So there's a bit of a continuum between you assessing and analyzing what you want and trying to find somebody, and then people being brought to you as well. And it kind of happens differently as you go through the windows. So there's that gap analysis. Then you've got the consideration of budget. So there's not many teams in the professional game that would just have unlimited budget for every single window all the time. You have to manage what your transfer budget is for the season, what your wage budget is for the season. Is there room to bring new players in? Can we pay transfer fees? Where are the wages in terms of percentages? Are we using it all up? Do you have to move somebody out to bring somebody in? Is there space to bring somebody new in, but you can't pay a transfer fee, so they have to be a free transfer or an out of contract? All of that is part of assessment during the windows in terms of the budget, so that prior to the new transfer windows opening, you know exactly what the plan is in terms of players. When that window opens, you've already got lined up, right, these are the targets that we're going to go for, and you understand that all of those targets are going to fit within the budget constraints that you would have. Then the next continuum is looking at short term to long term in terms of a player's potential and impact that they're going to have on the team immediately. So do you need somebody that is going to come in and in the very short term fix a problem for you? Because, as I say, you might have, say, a player might have a season-long ending injury and you need to replace them in the next window coming up. It might be that this is a gap that you've had in the team for the first part of the season, and you still haven't felt like you've fixed it, so you need to go in and fix it. Or you might be also looking at players in the long term, and so we might sign somebody that may not necessarily go straight into the team, but we've identified they have the potential to grow, and there's kind of a long-term strategy on bringing somebody in and gradually kind of transitioning them into first team player and a regular starter. And then there's your plan. So you always have the plan going into the window to make sure you know exactly what it is that you're looking for, and your targets are ready. And so that is essentially the recruitment identification and plan as quickly and as I guess clear as I could make it for you.
Excellent, Paul, and yeah, very, very fascinating. And I think you did a great job in breaking down all those stages. So I'm sure those that are tuning in will take a lot from that, and see what the professional clubs are doing and be able to apply that into their own environment, whether it be at a professional level or in an amateur context. So No, certainly, yeah, certainly very interesting. I do have a few questions, and again, I'm sure Jose will also have a few questions as well. But the first one that springs to mind kind of goes back to the beginning of your presentation. And you talk about the gap analysis,
Mhm.
and later you spoke about how you've identified players versus potentially players that are presented to you. I'm just interested in like the cadence or the speed of that process, and is your sense that typically you would go for players that you have been identifying for like quite a long time, or do you I kind of I guess are you happy to take a risk when it comes to players who've been presented? It's a short period of time and you've then got to cram all of that work into a condensed period. So yeah, I'm
Yeah.
just intrigued as to kind of how long that process would take, and if there's any allowances for when players are presented, do you have to kind of speed that process up quite significantly?
Yeah, that's yeah, good question. And it is also probably it depends is the answer to that. Because there is there is a real difference along that continuum. So for example, there was players that we identified when we first arrived that we still haven't signed yet. So we're kind of like still working through the process, still talking to the players, still doing all the analysis, still tracking them, still doing the eye test as often as we can, and kind of tracking this player like all the way through so that we can get a bit of a sense of where their potential is going and are they growing at the speed that we would like, and when might be the optimal time that they would be ready to be able to come in and impact in our team straight away. So there's kind of really long-term ones which have so far taken over 12 months in terms of that process. And then there's other examples where in January we had a little bit of an injury crisis, and that coincided with the window. And so we signed a player in January, which probably start to finish would have taken 2 weeks. So that was kind of a player that was presented, and then we did all the analysis and we went through that. And that whole process has to be sped up quickly because that particular player is available now. And there's going to be other teams interested as well. And so the longer you take in terms of doing that process, you may miss out on that player because there's a timing thing for it. And so we did that very quickly, went through all that, did all the analysis, did the presentation to the player, got the player in for a medical, and did all that within a 2 week period, like within the window as well. And that player hadn't been identified prior to that in terms of our own information. So that was one that was kind of came to us, and then we were able to kind of make it work, and everything added up for us, and we were happy to proceed. So yeah, it is a bit of a moving beast, and there's lots of things that kind of affect whether or not it's gonna work. And then you've always got those long-term players that maybe at this point in time you're considering too young and not enough experience, but have high potential. So you're kind of tracking all of those and seeing where they might come in. And then something I guess as well that adds to this that we haven't put in the presentation is what's within your own academy in terms of like players that would be coming up, and making sure that if there is players that are coming through the system and are showing potential, and you've started having them come in and train with the first team, and they're making that transition into the first team, like how they're doing, how they're presenting, what's their data telling you? Are they tracking better than maybe some players that you've been tracking from outside of your club? You're going to promote them first and give them the opportunity first, or are they not quite at the level yet? So you need somebody to come in for a certain period until this person gets to it. So you've kind of got to do a squad plan of what you need right now, like to play, because you get a game every weekend, what you need in a year's time, and then what you might need in 3 years' time, and you can kind of work out all of those things. And this is something that we're new in terms of, I guess, new coaches, new team coming in, and new plans, and we've got new ownership as well. So this is something we're kind of all building together, whereas you're going to have examples of other clubs that have been doing this for years that are really strong in this space, and they've got all of this information, and this system just works brilliantly regardless of who the coach is, and everybody knows probably the three Bs in the Premier League that do this brilliantly: Brighton, Brentford, and Bournemouth, who have become a bit famous for this at the moment. So they've got their systems, and regardless of who the coach is and how often they may change, everything stays the same, and the same quality of players keep coming through. So there are clubs that are further down the line with it that are doing it a lot better and more tried and tested, and then there's other clubs which is like us at the moment that are kind of building this process and going through it at the same time as trying to play and get results at the weekend.
Excellent, thank you.
Awesome. I know you kind of touched on in the presentation like a little bit of the comparisons between the A League where you worked and then now obviously in the UK. Two-part question. One would be it'd be great to kind of understand how many people were kind of working within that process you presented. So, just broadly, like, how big's the analysis and the recruitment team, and then your immediate like technical staff. And then the second part of the question, what would be interesting is, like, I know in the A League, like the head coach was quite responsible for a lot of that process. So for you after this season, like, what's been your kind of biggest takeaway and learning about recruitment?
Yeah. Yeah, they are very different. The A League, my experience in the A League women's competition was the recruitment, most of it, 90% of it is down to the head coach. So in terms of signing players for the A-League women's team, that would be me, and if we were lucky, we might have had coaches in place, like assistant coaches and an analyst. In my first season, we didn't have that in place straight away when I was appointed. So at the beginning, it was me as the head coach doing the ID, watching the games, trying to look at the data, and do that whole process as a coach, which I know a lot of coaches that will be tuning into this working in the amateur game or the semi-pro game, like they'll be experiencing that and doing that. So that was not hugely different. And then it got slightly easier. So once you've then got kind of assistant coach appointed, then you're kind of sharing the load a little bit, and you've got somebody to bounce ideas off, somebody to say, hey, what do you think of this player? I'm thinking they could be a good fit. What's your thoughts? Then we got an analyst in. And so once you have that, then you can start saying, right, I need this information on this player. Can you get this for me? And can you have a look at these clips, etc. So you're just sharing the load. I think that is the biggest thing. So in the A League, it was head coach, assistant coach, analyst, and then not every club in the A League would have a sporting director. So every club would maybe do the process of the recruiting slightly different. So with Phoenix, it was really good because we had like director of football, we had director of operations, and between them it was kind of like contacting agents, setting up contracts. So I didn't want to be the person in the chain that sat and negotiated the contract with the players like you have to do at amateur level most of the time. So it was great in terms of that support from the Phoenix and the club. They were able to do that process for me. So essentially, once the players had been identified and we'd worked out these were the players that we wanted to fit into our team, we would then put a case together, which we would present to the board, and we would present to the senior management at the Phoenix. And then if the board and the senior management were on the same page and we all agreed this was a good player to go after, good direction to go in, then the next step would be the club director of football would go through that kind of recruitment process that I showed, in terms of once I've done the presentation to the players and I've had that discussion online and they were interested, the next step would be that the club would contact them and their agent and do the negotiating around the contract and whether or not they sign or not. The biggest difference, Jose, is just the sheer amount of people and the sheer amount of data that's available to you. That those would be the biggest differences. We're a club that's just been bought out by Mercury 13, so we have new ownership of the women's team for Bristol City, and so as a kind of a standalone team. We would have across coaching department, medical department, performance, data analysis, recruitment, then off the pitch in terms of CEO, financial, marketing, sponsorship, media, all the things that surround a team, plus all the people that work with the team. We would have 40 plus staff for that one team. Whereas in the A League, we were one of the more progressive teams at the Phoenix in terms of full-time staff, and we had 8 full-time staff for the team, and then we had supporting staff that worked across both the men's and the women's team in head office. And so that was a pretty good setup for the A League. Whereas here in England, we've got over 40 people for the women's team alone, and so the sheer amount of staff is drastically different to the A League. So that means that we've got a head of recruitment, we've got 2 analysts that work for the team, we've got a head coach and 2 assistant coaches. So the process of that kind of working out and analyzing all of the information and the data is shared across all of those people at the beginning, and we might be given a specific role to go and do. So somebody might say to me, can you go and look at this player in this area and look at this data set and kind of tell me what you think and then report back or present something for this. A lot of the time the analysts are doing that type of work, and the head of recruitment is kind of overseeing all of those things. The biggest difference between the process is with the A League, it was kind of like the head coach dominating and saying, this is what I want, and this is kind of where I'd like to go, and getting the support of the club before you then went on and signed a player. Whereas here, it's much more a two-way process. Like as a coaching team and our head coach, you would have some players that obviously she feels like, okay, this player I'd like to bring in because they match what I want and stuff, and then she'd present that to everybody in the recruitment team, and that might be a direction, but equally there's just as much the other way. So the recruitment team are doing this, analyzing all of this between the windows, so that while we're playing games and trying to win football matches at the weekend, the recruitment team are building profiles of players for the next window, and next opportunities, and then they would come to the coaching team and say, these are the players that we've identified that we feel meet X, Y, and Z in terms of the gap analysis, and they tick all the data boxes, and then we'd then come into the process in terms of watching that player and doing the eye test and then going through that process. So there's just a lot more people. There's just a lot more people contributing to the process, and there's more designated roles within that ID and recruitment process than there would be in the A League. So yeah, and you just get way more data. It's quite hard. A League's a little bit isolated geographically. You can get data on the A League women and the A League men, but not as deep as the European competitions. So when you're in Europe and you're scouting predominantly in that European part of the world, the data that is available to you is just so much bigger and broader. So that helps the process a lot too.
Awesome. It's fascinating.
But I'll build on that slightly if I can, Paul, because what I like about what you're saying is that because there are a lot of people involved, it reduces the risk of getting it wrong. Like there's a lot more checks that go in, there's a lot more processes that have been involved. Now, are there any instances where players and the staff, etc., have kind of gone through that process, and what you see previously in all of the footage, etc., doesn't quite match what you get? And if so, like, how do you go about like managing that, knowing that you've identified certain criteria, certain outputs that the players are going to potentially have in your environment, and then they come into the environment and they don't quite meet the same standards, or they don't quite meet the same outputs as what you'd hoped? Like, how far does this analysis process extend beyond the player signing? Like, is it a continuation of that carries on?
Yeah, it would carry on post, so that you would analyze kind of how they're settling in and are they kind of achieving what you want them to. I guess the biggest part of what you're saying is the unknown of like how everything like adds up on paper, and then the reality of that person coming in is
Absolutely.
sometimes different and takes longer than you than maybe you envisage, or maybe that you want. But that is the reality of it as well. I mean, I can kind of see this very much clearly from the player's point of view, because I've made this move to the UK and move family. It takes a long time to like settle in a new place. So if a player is, has a partner or has kids, or like they're leaving somewhere that they've been for their whole life, and then you're bringing them to a whole new country, a new city, a new culture, a new language in some cases, that's the bit that the data doesn't tell you, exactly how that's going to go. They meet the criteria as a footballer, but then you've got the process in recruitment of it's the person, and is that person going to be able to adapt? How quickly can they settle in? We've had three players this season where English isn't their first language that we've signed, and so you have that whole process as well of, it's easier when somebody speaks fluent English, that when you're going through, you can support them with that process. We have staff at the club that are all around like player care, well-being, and so they're kind of helping them through settling in and kind of getting them settled off the pitch. If you can't communicate with that player directly, it makes that process so much harder as well. So we signed a French-speaking player in the summer when we first arrived, and her English was very basic at this point, and so she seemed to settle into England very well, but the communication was difficult. So we got some translation pods, and every time we spoke, we would put pods in, and she would put pods in, and they would directly translate English to French and back. So we would kind of have all the conversations like that. We would run all our team meetings with the pods in, so she could hear the translations as the team meetings are going through. And then we got to kind of January time, and she'd worked really hard at learning more English and understanding more English, and she'd got to a point where she then felt she didn't need the translation pods, and then so she transitioned into taking them out and just kind of listening and communicating in English. And now a year on, her English is so much better, and she's worked really hard at that. But that's just all part of the process of new players and settling in. And while she's doing that, she's also having to like play and perform every week, and it's very difficult for players. And you see even the highest profile cases where millions and millions are spent on players, you see that they don't settle quickly, and it takes time for them to really kind of show their potential. So you have to be patient and understand that process can be different for each person. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul.
No worries.
Oh, so that's a really good place to finish. And again, Paul, just want to thank you for your openness and transparency around the work that you're doing. And for those that are listening, I'm sure that whether you're working at a professional level, at a semi-professional level, or an amateur level, there'll be elements of what you've spoken about which will be applicable and can be scaled based on the context that you are working in. So again, knowing you as I do and knowing the work that you put together, there'll certainly be things that people will be able to take from that. So want to thank you, Paul, first of all, for your time today and speaking with all of our coaches. And we very much hope to be able to keep hearing from you and keep seeing your progress, not only in the Women's Super League 2, but beyond, and continuing some of the great work that you have done now for a number of years. So I really appreciate your time, and really do thank you for your contributions and your help towards developing the coaches here on the playing field.
No
Thanks, Paul.
problem.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys.